So in this video, we're going to look at an introduction to the nervous system, just so we can save a little bit of time in class. So when we look at our body and how we respond to changes in our environment, both external and internal, we're going to focus on using our senses. So here you might see a dog coming at you, and you're going to use your one or multiple of your 5 senses. So you have sight, so you're going to see the dog. You might hear the dog. You might smell the dog. I don't think you're going to taste it. But you might even feel the dog, like if you pet it or it brushes against you. Anyway, so one way or another, though, your senses are going to notice that there's a dog there and send messages to your brain. So when we see the dog, we just send, or there it's barking, you can hear it. And so your senses are going to see or hear or smell the dog and need to send that information to the brain. The brain is going to integrate that information and decide what to do with it. And so it will then respond. If you need to run from the dog, it might then send a message to your muscle cells to coordinate movement, or it can send a message, or also send a message to your adrenal glands to stimulate the response of epinephrine. So you can run. So here, this is where you have your fight or your flight response. So now let's look at, though, how do we send these messages? So when you see right here, when you see the messages right here, we're going to use our neurons for that. So here's the basic structure of a neuron. And when we look at the different parts, part A is pointing to the dendrites. Dendrites are what receive information coming in from the environment or from other cells. Then you have the cell body. This is a cell. So in the cell body, you have the mitochondria, you have the nucleus, you have the Golgi, you have all the parts you would find in your stereotypical animal cell, but in the cell body part. And then you have the nucleus because it's a cell. Then we have what's called the axon. So this whole area here is the axon. And this is where the message flows. Now, this is going to be the complicated part in class. What happens right here in these nodes is what people generally struggle with. Okay, so then you have your axon terminal. And this is where the message comes out in the form of neurotransmitters. All right, so when we look at, the only part I didn't mention here are these little yellow things. These are called the myelin sheath. So we will focus on that in class as well. Alrighty, so let's say you see a dog and that information needs to go to your brain. You're going to use a neuron. So the message, I'm going to use it in the form of red circle here. So it sends a message. You can see here I have the dendrites. They're the ones receiving the information. It travels down the axon and is released from the axon terminal. Now, a red circle, or like a molecule, doesn't directly flow through. You have changes in charge along the axon, and that's what we're going to see in class. But the impulse, the action potential, the message does travel down the axon. And so it reaches the brain. Then the brain has its own kind of neurons called interneurons. However, these neurons that come from our 5 senses about our environment are called sensory neurons. And they always send the message towards the brain or spinal cord. You can have sensory neurons inside your body, for example, like you have sensory neurons in the walls of your arteries that can detect, like the dendrites are checking for your blood pH to detect to see if there needs to be changes in homeostasis for that. So you have sensors within your body, but also externally, like in your skin, your eyes, your nose. So like smell would go up. You'd have specialized nerve cells there with their dendrites receiving information to send it to your brain about your environment and what you smell. Now, your brain, though, when it coordinates how to respond to this, is going to then pass the message along, what we call motor neurons. Now, when you see motor neurons, the message enters through the dendrites, so the dendrites receive the information. The message travels down the axon and targets the muscle cells. So motor neurons take information from the brain and spinal cord and send it to the muscles or glands. If you remember our endocrine system, you have your adrenal glands that are used during the fight or flight response. And so your motor neuron can also very quickly send a message to your adrenal gland in times of stress. So motor neurons take information from the brain and spinal cord and send it to your muscles and your glands. Okay. So let's say I'm out for a jog and I see a dog. And then, oh my gosh, so then I use a sensory neuron that's going to send the message to my brain. My brain's going to think about what to do, send that information to my legs, to my muscle cells to coordinate movement, and then also probably activate my fight or flight response so then I could run away real fast. Okay. So now, let's see the different types of neurons. You have your sensory neurons that sends the impulse to or towards your brain and spinal cord. Your brain integrates it, so right there I have it spinning. That's your brain thinking about, oh, what should I do? So you have your brain or spinal cord will process that information and then use a motor neuron to send it to your muscles or your glands. Now you notice my dendrites here are facing in opposite directions. And that's because this neuron at the top, we'll call it neuron A and neuron B. A is receiving information through its dendrites and sending it to the brain and spinal cord, where here the motor neuron, neuron B, is receiving information from the brain and spinal cord and sending it to the muscles and the glands. Okay. So sometimes, though, it doesn't have to go all the way in the brain. The brain doesn't have to process and think. So we've evolved quicker responses to help us survive. So we have what's called a reflex. And so let's say that you poke yourself with a push pin. You step on a piece of glass, you stick your hands in pockets full of push pins, which I did one time. Anyway, so you have what's called a stimulus, and you have, look at this, you have receptors in your skin. They're going to notice, oh wow, that hurts. Maybe I shouldn't keep my finger on that push pin. So it's going to use a sensory neuron, send the message to the spinal cord. Now the cool thing here is your hand is on a sharp tack. Your brain doesn't have to think about what to do. So for a quicker response time, they have a little tiny neuron or a smaller neuron right here in your spinal cord called an interneuron. Now the interneuron connects sensory neurons to motor neurons. So then that interneuron is going to pass the message on to the motor neuron, and that message travels to your muscle cells, which are your effectors. And so now this right here is the axon terminal. It'll release neurotransmitters, the acetylcholine neurotransmitter, and then your muscles will contract, and you can pull your hand away. So this right here has three neurons, the sensory, the inter, and the motor neurons. And they are going to be used all the time. So when I look at, if I go back to this picture, your brain is actually, let's clear off some of this. Your brain is actually all, your brain and spinal cord are all interneurons. There's no sensory or motor neurons in your brain and spinal cord. And so the brain, you can have brain surgery and remove part of your skull and poke your brain, and you don't feel anything because your sensory neurons are not part of your brain. They're all interneurons. Interneurons. And so your the way it works is you have your sensory neuron, and then here you would have your you'd have your interneuron. So there's your dendrites, and then you would have your axon and then your axon terminal. So the message would come into the dendrites from the sensory neuron, travel in the interneuron to a motor neuron, where it would release neurotransmitters, and the dendrites would receive that information and then pass it on to your muscles or glands. Okay, so then when we look at our different types of neurons, we can actually divide our nervous system into two groups. So you have your central nervous system, which is going to be your brain and your spinal cord, and then you have your peripheral nervous system, which is everything outside of your brain and spinal cord. And these red lines, the peripheral, is made out of motor and sensory neurons, and then your central nervous system is made out of your interneurons. Interneurons. Okay? All right. So now, though, if this is a sensory neuron sending a message to an interneuron, how does the message go from one cell to the next? Right? How does it pass? So this area here, this gap between neurons, is called a synapse. So here you have a synapse, which is between two neurons. So the message has to get across that. And this is where neurotransmitters come into play. And now this slide is kind of lame. I'll make a more detailed video showing a better example of how neurotransmitters are released. But the basics is when the message or the impulse or the action potential reaches the end of a neuron, that signals the release of these chemicals called neurotransmitters. Okay, so these neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, where on the dendrite, there's waiting receptors that are going to receive these neurotransmitters. Now you'll notice the neurotransmitters do not go inside the cell. They are actually opening voltage-gated ion channels for ions to flow inside, which will then change the charge inside the cell. But that's the more complicated part of the nervous system. That will be in a future lesson. Okay, so the point is neurotransmitters are what cross the synapse to pass the message from one neuron to the next. Okay, and then the impulse can continue. All right, so when we look at our nerve cells, a reminder, you have your dendrites receive information. The cell body is what composes the main components of a cell, ERs, nucleus, mitochondria, etc. You have your axon and then your axon terminal. All righty. So I think that, let's go ahead and look at these two cells. So to just summarize, right here you have what's called a synapse. And now this cell here is before the synapse. So we would call this the presynaptic cell. And then we would call this cell the postsynaptic cell, because it's after the synapse. And that's how we'd refer to two cells. So if you have your presynaptic neuron, have the message come in through the dendrites, travels down the axon. When it gets to the axon terminal, it releases neurotransmitters that the dendrites of the postsynaptic cell receive, and then the impulse or action potential can continue down the axon and be released at the postsynaptic cell's axon terminals. Okay, and so that is just our introduction to the nervous system, which will set you up nicely to study in class what happens in this area and how do we know when to send the message or the impulse. Okay, good job.